for the Zoom meeting together with the Illinois Business Immigration Coalition. We're grateful to have our U.S. Senator Dick Durbin, who will be providing an update on the federal negotiations, small business relief, and immigrant inclusion in the next COVID package. We have a exciting agenda that's going to be kicked off by Sam Scott, one of our co-chairs, and also Raul Raimundo, with our partners at Self-Help Second Federal Credit Union, Billy Lawless, our senator, and joining from Ireland, and many of you. First, I'm happy to introduce Larry Luster, who is ABIC's Small Business Recovery Manager. He's a native of Springfield, Illinois, to moderate today's Zoom meeting with Senator Durbin. Take it away, Larry.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending our event today. We're going to begin with some introductions, and as Becca said, she kind of ran through our agenda. We're going to provide an update from the Senator, some information from Tracy from Self-Help about the forgiveness process, and then finish up with some Q&A about the forgiveness process. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Sam Scott, who is one of ABIC's co-chairs. Mr. Sam Scott is a retired chairman and president and CEO of Corn Products International. Mr. Scott serves on the board at Motorola Solutions, where he's the lead director and the chairman of the Governance and Nominating Committee. He is also on the board of directors of the Bank of New York Mellon Corporation, where he's the chairman of corporate social responsibilities, and on the board of directors at Abbott Laboratories. Mr. Scott also serves on the boards at Northwestern Medical Group, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the Chicago Urban League, and the World Business, in World Business Chicago. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Sam Scott III.
Larry, thank you very much. And congratulations to you and your team on the work you've been doing with PPP. It's terrific, and I thank you for it. As Larry said, my name is Sam Scott, and I'm a co-chair of the Illinois Business Immigration Coalition. In May, I testified before the U.S. House Finance Committee on the state of Black-owned businesses and the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on them, and they've been devastated. Since then, data has shown that 42% of Black-owned businesses and 38% of Latino-owned businesses have shut their doors, and unfortunately, that may be permanent. The Federal Paycheck Protection Program helps some businesses stay afloat, but 84% of businesses of color have not been able to access the program. Why? Some of them don't have enough employees, some of them don't have existing relationships with banks, and some needed technical assistance to apply. For these reasons, I'm proud to work with the Self-Help Second Federal Credit Union, with Ray Raimundo and Martin Eakes, and through our partnership with President Preckwinkle, our IBIC team was able to assist over 180 Black and Latino businesses to obtain $4.7 million funding and saving thousands of jobs. Many of these small business owners that we help are here today. Thank you for your participation and for your fight. I know it's very difficult right now, but we need your voice, and we will do our very best to help you. I have 3 businesses that I have helped myself receive the PPP funding. They got the monies, and unfortunately, they are afraid to spend the money because they don't understand the forgiveness program. So we will be addressing that later, but that's a very important part of this overall program. Today, I'm honored to introduce a fighter for Illinois' vulnerable small businesses and immigrants, Senator Dick Durbin, who will provide an update on the latest federal COVID negotiations, including small business relief. Senator Durbin is an American attorney and politician serving as the senior U.S. Senator from Illinois, a seat he was first elected to in 1996. He has been the Senate Democratic Whip since 2005, which is the second highest position held by Democrats in the U.S. Senate. Please help me to welcome a champion for small businesses, for African Americans, for Latinos, for immigrants, and for all Illinoisans, our friend, Senator Dick Durbin. Senator Durbin?
Thanks, Sam. And let me just give you a few words, kind of summarizing the issues that you've raised. I know Raul Raimundo and Tracy Ward are also slated to be part of the program as well. I, of course, hope to answer any questions you have when it's over. So, okay, let's start at the beginning. We have a new pandemic. We're not sure how big it is, how bad it is, but all of a sudden, businesses are starting to close their doors. And in Washington, we had to do something fast, and we did. In a matter of 8 days, on March 26th, after 8 days of work, we passed the CARES Act, $3 trillion, the biggest single relief bill we've passed ever in the history of Congress. It represents about 60% of the total domestic spending of the United States. We did it in 8 days. And what did we do inside of it? Well, we had unemployment in there. We had help in there for some state and local governments. But when it came to the area we're talking about this morning, we created a forgivable loan program through the Small Business Administration. It was an ambitious undertaking. It was written by Marco Rubio and Ben Cardin, Republican, Democrat, Florida, Maryland. They put it together and passed it in a hurry. Not to say it was done without care, but they knew they had to get the money on the street quickly. So the notion was to put these billions of dollars out in forgivable loans. The categories that were created were pretty predictable. If you spent the money as a small business once you received the loan, and you spent it on paying salaries and compensation, or benefits, or mortgages, or rent payments, or utility bills, then you didn't have to pay it back. Show us that you've spent it on those things, it's over. Well, that seemed like a pretty simple formula, but then we found right off the bat there was an issue. Who is going to actually collect the information and process the loan? Well, it turned out the big banks were ready to go. They knew their client list. They knew the ones that were eligible, fewer than 500 employees. They knew the business relationships they had. They knew the history of the business. They could bring the people in short order, put together the application, and off it went. And that's how it worked. So the first round was really big bank oriented towards established businesses with working relationships with those banks. Not bad, we had to do that, but it turned out we were missing a huge segment of the population. Sam alluded to it earlier. There were businesses that didn't fit into that category. Some of them were not regular banking customers. Maybe their only contact with a bank was to actually have a corporate checking account or a business checking account. And they didn't have a banker per se looking out for them, or they could call for help. So they were kind of left by the wayside. So then we went into a second phase and said, listen, now we're going to do the Paycheck Protection Program, but we're going to focus on community banks and credit unions and financial institutions that can help these smaller businesses who, as Sam described them, just don't have a business experience that the larger small businesses had with banks. That was helpful, but still there were gaps. Over $100 billion left unclaimed. What happened in Illinois? Well, let me tell you as an example, when you look at the whole program, we've had more than 225,000 PPP loans in Illinois worth almost $23 billion. The program is over. It officially ended Sunday, August 8th. And the question is, what do we do next? First comes the prove up. How will the businesses prove that they actually spent their money on categories that lead to forgiveness on the loan? Is it going to be an elaborate process, or is it going to be a simple process? There's some who want a streamlined approach to how we do this to provide the forgiveness for loans under $150,000. I get that, but let me tell you, I also have a responsibility to make sure that people are not cheating in the system. We're going to find out ultimately. We don't know yet, but we're going to find out ultimately that some of the people who were loaned this money were fraudulent. It's just going to happen. I know it is. You know it is too. I don't know how many, what percentage, but we got to take it seriously. It's real taxpayer money and a real government program that was supposed to have some system of accountability. We don't know how much fraud was involved in it. But let me give you an example of what we're dealing with now. The SBA and Treasury only released the businesses' names that receive loans worth more than $150,000. That data accounts for approximately 73% of the dollar amount of loans approved, but only 14% of the total number of loans. So there's an awful lot of information we just don't have. We don't even know the names of the businesses that receive some of these loans. And the idea of automatic forgiveness, when we can't even establish that maybe it was a bogus business to start with, that gives me pause. I've got to answer for that. We all do. We've got to do something that is thoughtful and responsible. So Rubio and Cardin came through and said, let's consider a second round after August 8th for those who want to apply. Let's talk about the forgiveness process. We've had good cooperation on this. We really come to agreement on it. it is the least contentious of all the things before us. It was ready to go, but it mired down when it came to this whole question of whether or not we're going to have $1 trillion, $2 trillion, or $3 trillion in the next relief bill. And so the House of Representatives under Pelosi passed a version that would have extended the Paycheck Protection Program and the unemployment insurance, and it would have gone to the end of the year. They passed that 14 weeks ago. The Senate Republicans refused to take up any bill, to produce anything on the floor for a vote. That's okay. You know, I just got to tell you, the notion of going through the regular order of business in the Senate can take weeks, sometimes months. It'd be better if we had a proposal, a bipartisan proposal, and sat down at a table to negotiate. Well, an attempt was made. I'll give you some insight into how that attempt failed. We brought in Mnuchin, okay? Mnuchin, I don't know. Treasury Secretary. I've met him a half dozen times just to shake his hand. But those who were at the negotiations with him in the first round for the CARES Act on March 26 said he was a good negotiator. He came in, he was reasonable, he listened, he represented the president, he spoke for the president. We passed the bill, $3 trillion. This time around, Mnuchin's not alone, and that's significant. You should know it if you didn't hear it already. Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff, is also at the table. Meadows and Mnuchin representing the White House. Meadows is a decent guy on a face-to-face basis. I kind of count him as a social friend, but when it gets down to politics, he is pretty hard right. You know, he's a Tea Party guy in the House. And so this just gets under his skin when you start talking about $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there. Not that it's insignificant, but we're talking about the overall American economy. And the notion of $1, $2, or $3 trillion moving the economy is not an unreasonable proposal. But he is troubled with it. He doesn't want state and local government relief. They made that clear. He is really reluctant to see an extension of the $600 a week unemployment compensation. And as a consequence, the whole thing kind of broke down. It didn't help that Senator McConnell, the Republican Senate leader, and Congressman McCarthy, the House Republican leader, refused to even come to the table. They wouldn't enter the room. They wouldn't sit in the room with Pelosi and Schumer and Meadows and Mnuchin. Well, that sucks. I'm sorry. That's a big mistake as far as I'm concerned. They should have been there. They're paid to be there, but they didn't. And so we left a couple weeks ago from Washington without accomplishing anything. Now, we're supposed to come back September 8th. I doubt that it's sooner. We had the week for the Democratic Convention, another week next week for the Republican Convention, and then we're going to be knocking on the door of September and right after Labor Day return. I think there's a good chance that the Paycheck Protection Program will be extended, modified and extended. Here's what the version of it says that I think is likely to pass, the Rubio and Cardin version. It provides a second PPP loan to borrowers with 100 or fewer employers that have demonstrated a revenue loss of at least 50%. We're debating that revenue loss percentage, but that would make them eligible. It reserves 20% of the funds for businesses with 10 or fewer employees. It prioritizes underserved and rural borrowers, and it requires the SBA to collect demographic information. All of those things, I think, point in a positive way toward minority business owners. I mean, we really are getting out of the big leagues of the Chase and Bank of America and the other lenders. We're trying to get it down to a level, as you can tell here, 100 or fewer employees instead of 500 or fewer. Demonstrated revenue loss of at least 50%. 20% of the whole pot goes to businesses with 10 or fewer employees. So I think that that is going to enjoy bipartisan support and be part of any package that goes through. I don't think we'll be able to take it up until September the 8th at the earliest. The sooner the better. And let me just say this. What is it going to take to move the Republicans to finally sit down at the table and agree to anything at this point? It's going to take one of two things. It's going to take a president in Trump who's worried to death about his poll numbers and believes that he needs to sign millions of checks again with his name on it, claiming $1,200 as a gift from him or whatever he wants to claim. That's his business. If he wants to put his name on it, he can do it if he wishes. And secondly, it's going to take Mitch McConnell looking around to some of his Republican senators who've just spent 4 weeks at home and are going to come back and say, Mitch, these people are not too damn happy with cutting off the $600 a week unemployment check. We got to do something here. The businesses need help too. We got to do something. Doing nothing is unacceptable. If he's heard that enough, then those two factors, Trump and McConnell looking at poll results, may actually get us to the point of doing something. Raul, I think you're next up.
Yes, thank you, Senator, for all you're doing and championing, again, everything for Illinois and this country. I just want to follow up on something you mentioned. Given what you just said right now about possibly a new PPP program to help small businesses, it's still very critical that we figure out the forgiveness program part. There is a proposed Senate Bill 4117 that has been introduced in a bipartisan way that says that we can do automatic forgiveness, as you mentioned, up to $150,000. What I'm looking at right now is that's 86% of PPP loans are under $150,000, and only 27% of the funds are allocated to that. So to your point, a lot of big businesses got big loans, but the small ones that we're concerned about, as Sam mentioned, may not survive at all, need an automatic forgiveness program that is very simple, one-pager, that allows them to really start either spending the money that they're still holding on to because they don't know if they're gonna be able to get that money forgiven. We're told that it takes hours and hours to try to plan to apply for the forgiveness. Many of these small businesses don't have accountants, don't have financial planners. They're small retail, and for them, it is a disincentive to pursue additional PPP, as you're suggesting another bill might come in September. So this is already out there. I'm told that there is probably about 25 already Republicans on board on this bill, and only about 10 or so Democrats on it. So this seems to be something that has legs that I believe will help, to your point, these small businesses of color throughout the country that can plan ahead, not just for this PP, but it also will give an incentive for new businesses that didn't want to participate in this round. As you're suggesting, this new round could happen with these different new incentives to really apply if there is an automatic, very simple forgiveness program of up to $150,000.
So, Raul, the only issue I would raise is that we have not seen any data or information about businesses that receive less than $150,000. We don't even know the names of those businesses at this point. And so I'm just looking for some kind of accountability here. Let us at least know the names of the businesses before we say, we forgive you, go your way. That to me is not unreasonable. If they borrow the money from the federal government, it's taxpayers' money, and we want to forgive them the loan because they did the right thing. It's not unreasonable to say, tell us the name of your business and your name and where you're doing business. That kind of information has not been disclosed yet. So that's what I'm waiting on.
What could we do to help? This is an issue that has not just bipartisan support, but also bipartisan organizing support, because this is where the financial trade associations, the Community Bankers Association, and networks like ABEC, IBEC, and others, Urban League, are really pushing for, because we're seeing on the ground that these businesses are getting, if you will, strangled with more paperwork in applying for forgiveness.
I think doing a simple form is okay, but asking in advance for a disclosure of the names of the businesses and the amount of money they borrowed is not unreasonable. Once that information is available, I am not opposed to simple forgiveness loan, forgiveness statement.
So in terms of supporting you with that ask, what do you recommend that we are pushing that along with to Mnuchin, to the SBA director?
Yeah, just say to the administration, to SBA, release all the information of all the loans. Just put all the information out there. You've done the big boys. Why wouldn't you do the smaller businesses? Let's do those too. And an automatic forgiveness, simple forgiveness loan, I support it. Listen, I'm not anticipating a major scandal here. I'm anticipating, as I said earlier, there's some fraud. I'm clearly involved here. Some businesses represented numbers of employees or whatever it was, and turns out wasn't true. I mean, that is human nature. Somebody's going to say to me, Durbin, you threw this money away. You didn't even ask who was receiving the loan before you forgave it. Shouldn't we have a record of somebody taking $125,000 from the federal government that turned out to be a scam artist? Don't you think there ought to be a record somewhere? That's just,
Yes.
I think that's pretty basic.
Well, we'll definitely support you on this battle, and hopefully there's some resolution quickly so that our small businesses, we believe we have records of, are in need of getting this forgiven and applying for more on a simple process.
Good. It's a good cause. Thanks, Raul. I think Tracy Ward is supposed to be up.
Yeah, I think we might have time for one more question. I don't know if Karen Freeman at the Chicago Urban League, are you still on?
I am.
Okay, go ahead, Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Yes. And good morning. Hi, Senator. How are you today?
I'm great. How you doing?
Good, good. So I know that we have talked a lot about the SBA and their administration of PPP. I had a question as to whether or not there has been any involvement with HUD, given their role in urban development, and any discussions of what they might be able to do to help businesses, small businesses in particular, especially with Section 3, with the public housing and other levers that they may have to be engaged with.
Karen, can you tell me a little bit about the housing thing? I just don't know enough about that.
So with Section 3 under public housing, there is a responsibility to support residents and to really support small businesses in disadvantaged communities. That's one aspect, but generally, because HUD is also involved in urban development, we always think about them with housing, but they're really involved across the board in development. And it just seems to me that they have a role to play as we look to help small businesses recover from this pandemic.
Karen, I'll tell you, I'm just going to be real brutally honest and candid with you. I think the SBA is probably overwhelmed at the moment in terms of the assistance that is being asked for across the board. When we have so many businesses in America that didn't reopen, want to reopened, and now not sure they can stay there. I mean, the need is just incredible at this point. So I don't see any dedicated funds for that purpose, but I'm open to it. If in this next relief bill, we can provide money to the SBA to help these businesses, let me take a look and see if that's in there. And if it isn't, I think it should be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Senator, we want to thank you so much for your time in updating these businesses about what's going on with federal negotiations. And we look forward to continuing that line of communication just to make sure folks are informed, and then they can inform you about things that they're seeing on the ground, that we're seeing on the ground level.
Good. Thanks, Larry. Keep in touch. If anybody needs any help, get a contact to our office. We'll try to help any way we can. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Senator. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much, Senator.
Bye, Rebecca. You can come in out of the car now.
Thank you so much. So just to move us along with our program, a lot of our small businesses are here today because of the incredibly important forgiveness process for the PPP. And we're so happy to have Tracy Ward back, who is the director of SBA 504 loan program at Self-Help. Tracy brings years of experience and passion to the issue of equity and inclusion for the most vulnerable businesses. So please welcome Tracy to provide a PPP forgiveness presentation. Tracy?
Here. I will jump right in because we have a lot to cover in a short period of time, and we really want to leave some time at the end for your questions. So I'm going to try and focus on the most important questions that we're seeing as we go through this, but again, we'll go pretty quickly. If you flip to this next slide on recent updates to PPP, this chart basically shows in the right-hand column where it says now, these changes that went in place under the Flexibility Act in early June, we've gotten a lot of questions, but these apply to your loan no matter when you got your PPP loan. The one thing I want to highlight is your loan term. So your PPP loan, if you got it before June 5th, has a 2-year term. If you got it after June 5th, it should have a 5-year term. This could matter when it becomes time for you to apply for forgiveness if there's any unforgiven amount. banks now do have the option. They are allowed to extend your term up to 5 years. So that's a good change. If you do have an unforgiven portion and you have one of those earlier loans, you're going to want to reach out to your bank and talk to them to make sure you have more time to pay back any portion that doesn't get forgiven. Flip to the next slide. Potential additional changes that Congress is considering right now. I won't go into great detail on these because Senator Durbin talked about several of these, but I do want to emphasize that your stories and your experience is really important and impactful. Congress is working on this right now. So if you reach out to your senators and representatives and let them know what's working for you, what's helping you keep your staff employed, what's helping you keep your business running, that gives them the information, the real practical, actual real life information to try and make some good decisions right now while they're thinking about this. So let's jump in on the next slide. Under the current rules, what is required right now for forgiveness? What do you need to know right now to make sure you're using your PPP loan in the way you need to use it so that you have the best chance of being fully forgiven? There are 3 things you need to remember and do. One is make sure you use your PPP funds for eligible purposes. 2, you need to use it during your required time period. And 3, you need to maintain your staff. So let's go through each of those. On the next slide, you can use your PPP loan for payroll costs. You can use all of your loan for payroll costs, but you don't have to use the whole thing for payroll costs, but you do need to use at least 60% for payroll. There's lots of words on this slide. We've really tried to lay out what counts as payroll costs. The important thing to remember is if it counted as a payroll cost when you applied for your PPP loan, when they were determining the loan amount, it should still count when you're trying to figure out what's eligible for forgiveness. So those same types of things will count as payroll costs. Let's flip to the next slide on a little bit more some of the common questions that we've gotten on payroll costs. If your business is shut down, you may not have work for your employees. It is okay to pay your employees even if you don't have work for them right now. The primary intent of the Paycheck Protection Program was to allow you the funds to keep paying your staff so that they keep getting income, and that when you are ready to reopen, you don't have to rehire and retrain. You're ready to go from day one. So it's fine to pay staff even if you don't have work for them right now. We also get a lot of questions about hazard pay. It is okay to pay hazard pay to your employees. They need to do that right now. You can't exceed $100,000 annualized per employee. So that's, you can't exceed $100,000 annualized per employee. Sorry, that's getting a little feedback, I'm sorry. That's roughly $19.23 a week. The other thing that's critical to remember about increasing pay is if you are the business owner, you are not allowed to increase your own pay. SBA is strictly limiting you to your 2019 compensation. If you choose the 8-week period, you are limited to 8 weeks worth of your 2019 compensation. If you choose the 24-week period that's now available, you are limited to 2.5 months worth of your 2019 compensation. And that's because the loan amount was set based on 2.5 months. So it's important for business owners, you are capped, but your employees, you can increase their compensation. Other question, we've gotten a lot on that. Nonprofits, because of the way SBA's applications were really set up primarily for businesses, a lot of nonprofit executive directors or board members entered their information in the owner box. It does not make you an owner. Nonprofits do not have owners, so this really only applies to small businesses. If you flip to the next slide, you don't have to use your whole loan for payroll costs. There are some other eligible costs that you can use up to 40% of your PPP loan to pay. That's interest on mortgages, so building mortgages or equipment loans. those are allowable uses. Rent or lease payments, if you rent space for your business or you have an equipment lease, that whole payment is an eligible use. Business utility payments, those are eligible. Most of them are pretty straightforward, but there's been a lot of questions around what is a transportation utility fee. SBA clarified that just a few days ago. The only thing that counts in the transportation category is if your state or local government assesses a transportation utility fee. That's something they would charge you for road maintenance. So they've cleared that up. Unfortunately, it's a much narrower definition than I think a lot of businesses were hoping for. But at least you have some clarity and you know what would count and what won't. On the next slide, for a lot of sole proprietors, especially independent contractors, you may work from home. It's not as clear what counts as a business use of funds versus personal. In general, if it is the type of cost that you would include as a business expense on your tax return, then it should, if it falls in one of those rent or mortgage interest or utilities categories, it should be eligible for forgiveness. So let's flip to the next slide. We've covered what you can use the money for. So when do you need to use it? SBA calls this your covered period. Again, if you had a loan approved before June 5th, you had an 8-week covered period, but the Flexibility Act has given every borrower, no matter when you got your loan, up to 24 weeks to use this money. Day one is the day you get your funds, and even if you choose the 24-week period, which we think most businesses are finding to be the best option, you can apply early. If you end up using all of your funds by the end of week 15 or 16, you can apply at that point. You'll choose the 24-week period. You'll apply based on when you used up your PPP funds. There is still this option of an alternative payroll covered period. It's less critical now that you have 24 weeks, but it may make things easier for you. So if you have a biweekly or more frequent payroll cycle for your business, instead of day one being the day you got your loan funds, you can line up your day one to your first payroll cycle after you get your loan funds. So if you got your loan funds on a Wednesday, your next payroll cycle is biweekly. It starts on that following Monday. For payroll purposes, that Monday can be your day one. So it just kind of lines things up, so that may help. The next slide, let's talk a little bit more about your required time period and whether you would want to choose 8 weeks or 24 weeks if you're one of those early loans that has that option. Again, most businesses that we're working with, 24 weeks just gives you a lot more flexibility to actually use these funds for the required purposes so that you can be fully forgiven. We definitely recommend choosing the 24-week period if you are your only employee. So if you're an independent contractor or a sole proprietor with no employees other than yourself, if you choose the 24-week period, you can use your whole PPP loan for your own payroll. We think that is the easiest, least complicated way for you to apply for and get full forgiveness. And so we're really encouraging that. If you choose 8 weeks and you are your own employee, you cannot use the full loan for your own payroll. So let's flip to the next slide. You know the time period now for your covered period, but what payments count? So it's okay if you paid the cost during your covered period, and it's also okay if you incurred the cost during your covered period, even if you actually make the payment afterwards, as long as you're paying by the next scheduled due date. So let's walk through an example. If your covered period runs from June 1st to October 4th, your May utilities bill, you incurred those costs before your covered period, but your regular due date is in June, so it's during your covered period, you make that payment, the whole thing counts towards forgiveness. Your October utilities bill, it's normally due November 10th, after your covered period is over. The portion that was incurred during your covered period, so those first 4 days of October, you could count those towards forgiveness. The critical thing to remember here is prepayments do not appear to ever be forgivable. And the points SBA has clarified on this, they have been clear that, for instance, if you have a December utility bill and your covered period ends on October 4th, you can't pay your December utility bill during your covered period and count it. It's not due yet, it wasn't incurred yet. So don't use your PPP funds for prepayments. Let's jump to the next slide. And again, I know I'm running through this very quickly, but we'll try and hit the highlights. The third big thing you need to remember to be eligible for as much forgiveness as possible is you need to maintain your staff. Again, that was a critical part of this PPP legislation when it passed. There are two different requirements to maintaining your staff, and they're two independent, separate determinations. One is you need to maintain each employee's wages. The other is you need to maintain your total average full-time equivalent, so total number of employees and hours they work. So this gets complicated. So I do want to walk through a couple of examples on this. If you had an employee in January that you were paying $20 an hour and they were full-time, they worked 40 hours a week, and then COVID hit, and during your covered period for the PPP loan, you kept paying the employee $20 an hour, but you had to cut their time back. They're only working 20 hours a week now. Again, these are two separate questions you're going to ask. One, did you reduce that employee's wages more than 25%? No. You were paying him $20 an hour before COVID, you're paying him $20 an hour now. So you don't have to worry about a forgiveness reduction based on this employee's average hourly wages. Did you reduce your total full-time equivalents? Yes. This employee was a full-time 40-hour-a-week employee. Now they're half-time 20-hour-a-week. So you've got a half an employee FTE reduction. And so unless you meet an exception, that will count against your forgiveness amount. So let's flip to the next slide here. So this first point of this, maintain average weekly wages. You just have to keep it within, you can't cut more than 25%. If you do have to cut any employee's wages by more than 25%, if you can bring them back to their regular wages before December 31st and before you apply for forgiveness, then it won't count against you. SBA is going to have you compare their average weekly wages during your covered period to what that employee's average weekly wages were from January 1st to March 31st. That is your time period for this wage comparison for every PPP borrower. Let's flip to the next slide and quickly walk through a couple of examples to help think this through. If you have an hourly wage employee, say Rocky in January through March, Rocky made $20 an hour. COVID hit, you had to cut Rocky's pay to $14 an hour. That's a reduction of 30%. You're allowed to reduce up to 25% with no impact on forgiveness, but you've gone over 25%. That amount is $1 an hour. To get the average weekly wage reduction, which is what SBA is looking for, you do need to think about how many hours a week was Rocky working January through March. If Rocky averaged 10 hours a week for that period, then you multiply that $1 by those 10 hours, you get an average weekly wage reduction of $10. Here is where it gets important. If you have the option to choose 8 weeks, you're one of those earlier pre-June loans, you might want to consider it. If you've had to cut staff wages by more than 25%, that average weekly wage reduction gets multiplied by the full number of weeks of your full covered period. So if in this case, if you chose the 8-week period, you have an $80 reduction to your forgiveness amount. If you instead choose the 24-week period, no matter when you apply, even if you apply early for forgiveness, you're going to have a $2,400 reduction to your forgiveness amount. Again, unless you meet the exception that sometime before December 31st, you bring Rocky's pay back up to $20 an hour. You don't have to do back pay. You just have to start, paying $20 an hour again. And then you can apply for forgiveness and this won't count against you. Let's flip to the next page for a salary example. It's pretty much the same thing, except since these are annualized, this is your salary for the year. You just divide by 52. So in this case, she would end up with a $100 average weekly wage reduction. You can see how that works through the formulas. And again, if before December 31st and before you apply for forgiveness, you are able to start paying WANA a full $52,000 a year again from that point forward, then this would not impact your forgiveness amount. So best case, if you can avoid reducing anybody by more than 25%, but if you can't, you at least have this option to, once things get a little bit better for you, to restore their salary to avoid this reduction. Let's flip to the next slide. The other prong, the other requirement of maintaining staff is maintaining your full-time equivalent number of employees. If you reduce your total average full-time equivalents, it will reduce your forgiveness amount. For this, SBA has now provided the formula that you need to use to calculate full-time equivalents. So I won't walk through that, they're spelled out. The important thing for you to remember here, no employee can count as more than one FTE. So even though you may have an employee who works 65 hours a week, they still only count as one FTE. We'll flip to the next slide. For this calculation, you're still going to compare your covered period total to your pre-covered period total, but SBA is giving you some options here. So for the period you're using to compare back to, you're going to choose from among one of these options that SBA is giving you. You're going to choose the period where you had the lowest number of FTEs, because what you want to show is that you still have at least that many during your covered period. The one thing I would highlight here is you do not need to worry about the number of employees you put on your original PPP loan application. SBA had not told us how to calculate FTEs. They had not explained what they needed or what time period. So whatever you put on your original PP application is not counting against you. You will use one of these time periods, use SBA's formula, and calculate your pre-COVID period and your covered period at the time you apply for forgiveness to see how that impacts you. So on the next slide, I want to quickly just highlight, even if you had to cut employees, and you will have FTE reductions, there are several exceptions to this now. SBA and Congress recognized and added a good broad exception in the Flexibility Act that says if your business or your nonprofit was complying with COVID restrictions that have been put in place by the CDC or by your state or local government, if you were complying with that COVID guidance for safety or sanitation, then it's okay if you had to cut your staff. This won't reduce your forgiveness. You need to document it. You need to keep the restriction or the guidance that applied to your location. Keep your financials to show that this kept you from operating at the same level of activity as you used to, and this will avoid a forgiveness reduction. You'll see below that I've listed some of the others. Maybe that doesn't apply to you. I think it's pretty broad. I think in most cases that big exception applies. But if it does not, there are other exceptions that if you had an employee, for instance, that you had to fire because they were doing things you had to fire them for, that's okay. That's not going to be held against you. I'm going to flip to the next slide. This was really a section we're going to focus on forgiveness application tips. The two current applications that SBA has out are frankly both incredibly complicated. There are lots of challenges to completing either one of these forms. There is an easy version. It is still pretty complicated, but it is definitely of the two current forgiveness applications, the one that if you can meet the terms and apply using that easy form, you're going to want to. If you are a business with no employees other than the owner, and that was true when you applied for the loan, it's true now when you apply for forgiveness, you can use the easy form. And again, you can use the whole loan to pay your own salary. We think that's the easiest, simplest way for you to get forgiveness. If you have employees, you still might be able to use the easy form if you don't have wage reductions over 25%, and you either meet this exception that COVID restrictions and guidance have kept you from the same level of business activity, or you didn't reduce your full-time equivalents other than employees that either refused to come back or open positions that you weren't able to find a qualified person to fill. So if you meet one of those, you can use the easy form. Again, it's not all that easy, but it is better than the long form. So that's the one you're going to want to try to use. I'm going to jump through these next couple of slides that go through some examples. I think they kind of spell out to help you think through, can you use this form? So it's the slides with the charts. James, if you just want to flip through each of those real quick and just keep flipping through just for time. I want to get to the slide that talks about double dipping. And this is talking about if you have payroll costs and double dipping, a little farther ahead. That's it. Thank you. So for nonprofits, we've gotten the question a lot about if they're getting other federal funding, how do they pair that with PPP? So there's some information that the Office of Management and Budget has issued on that. So I'll just highlight that here. You really, if you have another federal funding that is restricted to payroll for the same time period and you're paying your staff using that other federal funding, you would not want to claim that for PPP for forgiveness. Same thing, the bottom bullet point on this slide about unemployment. If you are a business where you are the only employee, you may be an independent contractor, you can't draw unemployment at the same time you are have your PPP funds because PPP is paying your salary. So you just wouldn't want to do both. You wouldn't want to put yourself in that situation. Quickly, the next slide, just want to highlight, a lot of you got SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loans or the EIDL or an EIDL advance. These are great low-cost loans. We really encourage you, if you don't have one, to apply with SBA if you need cash, if you need capital to keep your business going. It's not forgivable, but it is a 30-year low interest rate loan, and we think this is a good source of funds if you need it. But some applicants also got an EIDL advance. These aren't still available, but for a short period of time, SBA had funds and issued advances up to $10,000 to borrowers that applied for an advance. Even though everything publicly on SBA and Treasury's website has said that these EIDL advances do not have to be repaid, if you got a PPP loan, the current law right now requires that your forgiveness amount be reduced by the amount of your EIDL advance. So you would ultimately end up repaying that despite all of the language that says you don't have to. That is unfortunate, but that is the current state of the law. So we really want to make people aware of that so you're not surprised when you end up getting that. You know, even if you've done everything right for forgiveness, if you got an EIDL advance, you're going to have to pay that back. The last slide, just a couple of other tips. Even if you don't meet all the requirements to get 100% forgiven, you can apply for forgiveness to the extent you did meet requirements. So you can get partially forgiven, and you should do that. Hopefully you can get fully forgiven, but you can definitely apply for the portion that's compliant. We do recommend waiting right now, even if you've already used all of your PPP funds, because Congress is looking right now at this. As was raised at the beginning of this conversation, there are proposals for a more streamlined forgiveness process that would essentially require you to certify that you use these funds in good faith. You tried to keep your employees on staff. You were trying to keep your business open. These rules have been confusing, but you did your best to use these funds the way you were supposed to. We're hopeful that that passes because right now the process is so complicated. We think it is going to trip a lot of borrowers up and that they'll unfortunately end up repaying what was promised to them as a forgiven loan. So we really hope that some streamlined process gets in place. So we're really encouraging borrowers to be patient right now. And we're hoping this process improves so that it doesn't require you to repay a big portion that you really shouldn't have to repay. You did what you were supposed to do. Last slide. This just highlights the things that SBA will review. The only thing I really want to highlight on this slide before we move to Q&A is the question about what's SBA going to consider as fraud. If you have committed fraud, even if there's automatic forgiveness, SBA will prosecute fraud. And SBA, unlike SBA has not released borrower names to Congress, but SBA has information on every PPP borrower, and SBA is really good at uncovering fraud and prosecuting it. But I have a lot of calls from borrowers who are concerned what counts as fraud. They're doing the best they can. These rules have been confusing. A miscalculation and a mistake, an honest error is not fraud. The cases that you've seen in the news, the things that rise to the level of fraud are people who lied about having a business, who doctored forms and said, I've got 10 employees that each make $1 million a year when they had none. That's fraud. Using these funds that are meant to save your business to buy yourself a shiny new Lamborghini, that's fraud. Doing your best to do these and making an honest mistake is not fraud. So I don't want you to be concerned that you have exposed yourself to liability when you're doing the best you can. So that's kind of the point I want to end on, hopefully reassuring you that you're doing what you need to be doing with this money. That is not fraud. And I want to turn it over, thank everybody, and turn this over for Q&A. Hopefully we still have a little time left for that.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy, very much. That's very helpful. Now we're going to pivot to a little bit of Q&A. I know we're running up against the clock, but we'll do just a couple of questions that have come up. First question I want to ask Tracy is, what are the terms in terms of the rate and timeline for repaying PPP if it's not all the way forgiven? And do you have any information about the terms and percentage and timeline for EIDL loans as well?
Oh, sure. So if you apply for forgiveness for your PPP loan and you have an unforgiven amount, you will pay interest, you'll repay that unforgiven amount at 1% interest. If you have one of the earlier loans that was approved by SBA before June 5th, your note has a 2-year term. I would encourage you to talk with your lender because lenders now have the ability to extend that term up to 5 years, and that'll just give you a little bit longer timeline. Depending on the amount, you may not need that, but if you need longer to repay whatever's unforgiven, talk to your lender, and hopefully you can get at least up to 5 years to repay it. For the EIDL loans, those are 30-year terms. The first 12 months are deferred. If you're a small business, the interest rate is 3.75%. If you are a nonprofit, it's 2.75%. Again, those aren't forgivable, but they are low-cost, long-term, more flexible uses debt that you can apply directly with SBA for.
Thank you, Tracy. Our next question, I'm going to give it to Omari. What are some of the differences that you should be thinking about when it comes to forgiveness for sole proprietorships and independent contractors? Any differences in documentation or any differences in the application itself?
There aren't a lot of differences between the independent contractor and the sole proprietor. For tax purposes, they're effectively the same thing, and for forgiveness purposes in the application process, they're effectively the same.
Great, thank you. Tracy, here's a question. I thought that the full-time employee reduction could be no more than 10%. Based on your presentation, is it true that any reduction in full-time employees will count against forgiveness?
Yes, if you don't meet one of the exceptions, and again, we think there are lots of good exceptions now, but if your total FTE count is reduced at all, that is a proportional reduction against your forgiveness amount if you don't fit within one of the exceptions. But again, really pay attention to those exceptions. We think for most borrowers, they will cover that for you.
Great. Omari, would garbage pickup costs be considered a utility with PPP?
Yeah, it would be. It would be. What's your general business utilities, your mortgage, lease payments are all business expenses that are covered under PPP.
Thank you very much. And last question, I know you covered this, Tracy, but just to be really clear, should I start the forgiveness process now or should I wait?
I would really recommend waiting. You are allowed to apply for forgiveness once you've used up your PPP funds, but you have 10 months from the end of your covered period to apply for forgiveness. So you don't have a imminent deadline that would make me say you should apply now. We really do think Congress is listening. They are at least proposing some changes that hopefully consensus will build and will get in place that could do some things that could be really helpful for you. One, they're looking at potentially expanding what you could use the funds for. So maybe you were able to use part of the funds, but not all for what are currently eligible purposes. If those purposes get expanded, that then might allow you to get more forgiveness. If Congress decided that making you repay the EIDL loan after everything publicly posted about the EIDL, or not the EIDL loan, the EIDL advance after everything publicly posted about it said you would not have to repay that, Congress could decide to change that, and that would then not reduce your forgiveness. But right now, if you got an EIDL advance, it will reduce your forgiveness. Primarily, we do think there's a lot of support for a more streamlined forgiveness process. Right now, even the easy form is pretty complicated. It's hard to work through it, especially for really small businesses that don't have accountants or attorneys on staff. It is a real challenge to work through it. And we are very hopeful that Congress will pass some form of streamlined forgiveness, at least for smaller loans, that allows you to certify that you did your best under really confusing rules and in a really crazy time to use these funds the way they were intended, and you should be allowed for forgiveness. That doesn't let anybody off the hook for fraud. SBA will track down cases of fraud and prosecute, and they're very good at that. But if you did your best to use these funds the way you were supposed to, then it should not be hard. There should not be additional hurdles for you to get the forgiveness that you were promised. It should be simple. So we're really hopeful about that. And that's getting too much on a soapbox about this, but we really do feel strongly that should happen. So I would recommend waiting right now just to see if Congress does make some changes that are really helpful.
Great, thank you, Tracy. And just so everybody is aware, we will be sharing that slide presentation with you, but I'd like to kick it back to Larry because that's all the time we have for questions.
All right, everyone, we really appreciate you all attending our webinar. If you have any additional questions about forgiveness that we can get over to Tracy, feel free to email me. My email address is lluster, so that's LLUSTER @AmericanBIC.biz. Again, that's lluster @AmericanBIC.biz. Just shoot me an email with your questions, and I'll get them to Tracy, and we'll help you work through that. Again, thank you all so much for your time, and have a great day. And thanks all to all our presenters too.